Hi everyone, welcome to the Keylink kitchen. Today is a very special day. We've got some special guests here, so I hope we find you all well and ready for this live demonstration. So without further ado, let me introduce Michele from the Martellato chocolate equipment manufacturer.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to Keylink demonstration. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Albertine Michele and I'm the export manager of a company, and since 1 year I'm also in charge of the public relations of a company. Today I'm really flattered to be here with one of our main distributor in UK and with my ambassador Philip Khoury, the head pastry chef of Harrods. Together we will do a demo here in the company. The aim of this demo is how to create recipes and ideas using Martellato equipment. Of course, during the demo, if you have any question, do not hesitate to ask us. At this point, I'm with all my pleasure to introduce Philip Khoury. Enjoy the demo. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele.
Thank you, Philip.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Phil Khoury. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So today we're going to be going through 3 recipes, 2 recipes in depth, and I'm going to be showing you a range of techniques, and we're going to explore some plant-based confectionery. So without further ado, I'll explain you what we're going to do and then we'll get going. To begin with, we are going to produce a 3-layered bonbon. This is one that's going to be enrobed or hand dipped. So we've got some nice frames, lovely melting chalk and a guitar cutter. So I'm going to explain all those things to you. To begin with, we've got a layer of Pecan Praline, Apricot Ganache and an Apricot Ganache that we're going to cut and then dip. And in the next product, got a gianduja with an aerated next chocolate. And then we're going to pipe some caramel on top, put some extra nuts, and then hand dip that in chocolate as well. For the third product, it's not really a product, I'm just going to be showing you a mold that I'm really excited about that I created with Martellato, the new Mount mold. And then finally, as an extra bonus, I just want to show you the spinner pastry equipment because it's just really cool. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. We're going to start with the pâte de fruits because we need that to set. So we've got an apricot pâte de fruits. I love apricot. They're just so fragrant, tasty. There's really good sweetness and flavor, but without too much sweetness. So we're going to start. We've got apricot puree with glucose. I'm going to pre-mix some pectin jaune or regular pectin with the caster sugar. And I've just got some tartaric acid for a bit of extra acidity, and that's going to just help the gelling process, which I'm going to add later. We don't want to add that too early. So we've got the puree and glucose. I'm just going to move this across so you can see it. And then I'm just mixing the pectin with the caster sugar so it gets evenly distributed and we don't have any undissolved lumps. So all in. I'm just going to mix it and then bring it to a boil. Now we like to add the acid later on because that's going to activate the gelling. And we don't want it to gel too early, otherwise it's just a bit harder to cook out, so we'll leave that to later. So you see, lovely induction works so quickly. I'm going to bring that to a boil. Now with most purees, they usually have some fruit pulp in them, so we just need to stir them, otherwise they can catch on the bottom. With a small batch like this, it's going to cook really quickly. So I'm just going to leave that there for a second. Now we've got these awesome frames for a Martellato. They come in different thicknesses. So this is says on the thing, 3 millimeters thick. And we're going to use that to create the pâte de fruits layer on top. See, that's come to a nice boil. I don't know if you can hear it, but I can hear it's setting on the bottom, like not setting, but scalding on the bottom. So you do want to keep stirring it as you go along, especially if you're cooking it really quickly like I am. Otherwise, a medium heat is adequate. All right, so I'm just going to start probing it. We've got a digital thermometer. And we're going to cook that to 107. Products like this, where we're using sugar, sugary paste or caramel, are really dependent on the final cooking temperature. So with a pâte de fruits, we want to go up to 107. But if you were to cook this to 103, exactly the same recipe, you'd end up with a really nice gel texture that has a great shelf life and which you can pipe into the tip of bonbons once it's cooled down. Right, so sometimes you can do a test. You can just turn the heat down and put a dollop from the silicone spatula onto a cold surface to check the test once you've added the acid. But really, we want to be adding the acid to stop the cooking, because you're adding a cold element, even though it's really just a small amount. So going to just add that in now. It's going to cool down the mix and stop it from cooking out even more, which would result in a firm rubbery texture. And then we're going to pour it in. So these frames do bend, so you kind of want to do this very quickly. I'm pouring the pâte de fruits in one end, going right up to the corners, and then all the way across as evenly as possible, because what we want to do is just get in one movement, without agitating it too much, a really nice layer. So before it gets a chance to set or do anything, we want to scrape it all the way. There we go. There we go. So we're just going to put that aside to set. And we'll come back to it.
Sorry, Philip, how long would that usually take to set?
Oh, it happens really quickly. So within 10 minutes even. We just want it to cool down until it's at least less than 30 or 25 degrees, so that when we put it onto the ganache, we're not disrupting the crystallization or warming up the ganache too much. But generally, you want to put it on when it's cooled down fully.
And what sort of shelf life do you expect with that sort of, this product?
Yeah, pâte de fruits lasts a long time. I'd say minimum 6 weeks. So generally, when you make a pâte de fruits as an individual pâte de fruits, you're going to toss them with sugar and then let them dry overnight to evaporate any extra moisture. And that's just going to ensure they have perfect shelf life and a good texture.
Also, if you wanted a more pipeable consistency to your pâte, what would you do? Definitely
just, instead of cooking it to 107, cook it to 103 and it's perfect. So once it's cooled down fully, again, you can use it to pipe in, and it's just got this kind of set texture, but still pipeable and fluid. It's really lovely. So next up we have our crunchy layer. So this out. So we're going to make a praline. I've already roasted these pecans. I like to go low and slow, so 150 degrees in a fan forced oven. Pecans are quite high in fat, so we don't want to, we do adjust the ratio. So if you're using, say, a peanut or other nuts that have slightly less oil, you want to use less chocolate. So as a rule of thumb, you want to go 1 part chocolate or couverture and 2 parts nut paste or nut butter. And that's going to give a texture that's just set, but will cut really nicely with the guitar. So I've got my pre-roasted and cooled down nuts in here. I'm going to blend them to a paste, and we're going to add the chocolate directly to it. The other way of doing this, I'll show you for the next product, is to just take the nut butter or nut paste and then mix in tempered chocolate. But we're going to do this all at once, and then I'm going to cool it down and I'll show you how we produce it. So I'm just going to... So I don't know if you can see what just happened there, but essentially it starts, the oils are starting to come out and it's going to start turning to liquid. So if you look through, it's actually started to turn to a paste, and if you touch the side, it's actually starting to warm up. So I'm going to add our Caliber dairy-free, Caliber Next NXT dairy-free, and I'm going to keep blending it. I don't know if you can't smell this, but it smells amazing. The roasted nut profile, the chocolate, it smells really good. Now, with all nut paste, I like to add a pinch of salt, Just a pinch of sea salt seasons the nut and brings out the flavor and just tempers the sweetness a little bit. And we're done. So I'm gonna just bring this into the middle here, but it's now nice and liquid and the chocolate's melted through. It's slightly warm, just enough to melt the chocolate. And we're going to, I guess, temper this by just spreading it out onto the marble and cooling it down to 20 degrees. And this is just to get the crystallization going. Thing with when you add oil to chocolate, it reduces the crystallization temperature. So we really need to kind of cool this down to get it to set really nicely and consistently. We're just gonna table it. You could alternatively just pop it in the fridge and stir it while it cools down. But this is just like a gianduja or a praline texture. So I'm just spreading it out to cool it down. And chocolate is a really good conducer. What's the word I'm looking for? Conductor of heat. So infrared thermometers work really well at gauging the temperature. So that's at 25. Just gonna scrape this back into the bowl. And we're going to bring out our lovely frame system to create perfect layers. So I've just got a piece of like guitar sheet and I've got a moistened cloth. I'm just going to stick it down with a bit of that moisture. So I'm just lining it up so that I have a nice surface to take the slab off. And I'm just going to push out the air pockets. And then before I put my first frame down, I'm actually going to create the shablon first so I don't have to bother with it later. And I'm just going to spread some tempered chocolate on the base, or you could over-crystallize some melted chocolate. So then we've got our first frame, so I'm using the 5mm frame for the base. You see these two pins line it up really nicely, and that extra bit of chocolate is going to create a nice seal. So I'm just going to pour this paste at the end there. And then just kind of spread it into the frame. So this frame is a 24cm frame, but you can get much bigger sizes. In the typical kind of production environment, you might be using a 30cm frame to go with the 30cm guitar cutter. So you have different sizes. This is more of a test batch or lab size, and the other one is for production, where you have a lot of volume to get through. So I'm just using the scraper again to create a nice layer. And then we just want to so we've got our crunch on the bottom, and then I'm going to put the next layer on for the ganache. I'm just going to put this in a cool spot. Alright, so for the ganache, we've got, this is a really small batch, so I'm not going to use a saucepan. We've got apricot puree, a neutral oil with some invert sugar, and some Caliber dairy-free NXT. So what we want to do is just scrape the oil and the invert sugar So the invert sugar is just really good at helping create a nice emulsion, prevent and promote crystallization, and then also at prolonging shelf life by attracting the moisture in the recipe. So we're just going to pop that in the microwave. So we've got some dairy-free NXT. I really like NXT as a dairy-free milk chocolate alternative. It's got a really nice rounded flavor on its own. It is an adjustment, but in recipes it works really, really well. It's got a nice cocoa intensity, but then it's also, it just works really well, adding that creamy characteristic that we know and love about milk chocolate. So with the, we've got the liquids here. We don't want to heat them up too much because we want the finished temperature of our emulsion to be around 30 to 35 degrees. And that's going to ensure that it sets really nicely and really quickly. So I've got unmelted Calais so that the temperature comes down nicely. And we're just going to A lot of people think that once it's combined that you're done, but the work doesn't stop there. You really need to make sure that it's blended really, really well. Oop, that was close. So you want to blend it for at least, for a batch like this, could be done in 30 seconds, but you want to be blending it for up to a minute if you're doing a large batch. So it's really thick, really glossy. There's a little elasticity to it. I don't know if you can see very closely, but what we basically want, you might see the shine is not like uninterrupted, that there is some fiber, and that's from the apricot puree. Just going to. So I'm going to just talk through the next stage because I've got some pre-prepared. But essentially on that next frame, we're going to smooth the ganache to get another really nice layer. You see that's not a lot of ganache, but we're going to get maybe 70 pieces of chocolate from this one frame. So using these guitar systems is really good because you get a really high output and it's quite efficient to use. So we put that next layer on, and I'll come back to it. But then we also have the pâte de fruits, which goes on top. So what we tend to do is you'll see that this pâte de fruits is set and the frame will come right off, but we don't want to use it. We can flip it straight over onto the ganache. Basically we line it up on top of the ganache and then lower it down slowly onto the ganache so we don't get any air pockets, and then we can peel that off to get a really nice layer on top. So I'm going to leave that for now. I'm going to go through tempering with the melting tank. So in here, I've got 3 kilos of Guayaquil extra bitter. And the good thing about Guayaquil is it's got a beautiful, rounded, super smooth flavor profile, but then it's extremely fluid. And for enrobing chocolates, you really want to pick a fluid chocolate. And this one's got, I think it's 3 or 4 out of 5 droplets on the pack, which is really good. Like, I don't know if you get a sense for how fluid it is, but it's really important because you just want a really nice thin layer when you're dipping your pralines. So I've got 3 kilos in here. We're going to take 25% of the total chocolate mass, which is 1 kilo here, and stir it in. So the melting choc is really good. Right now it's set to 45 degrees, and you can, it's got preset profiles, and I'm just going to change that to dark. And what that does is it's just going to automatically drop it down to 31 degrees as a holding temperature while I stir in my unmelted Calais. So I like to use a firm spatula because silicone ones can kind of have a bit of flex to them and splash chocolate around. So I'm just going to add this in and just mix it very vigorously. The key thing with these types of holding tanks is that you are really agitating the mass, because you've got kind of uncrystallized chocolate with crystallized chocolate, and you really want to get a really homogeneous mass so you don't have any streaks. The other really nice thing about the digital melt-in chocks is that they have a digital probe attached. So this measures the current temperature of the mass that's in the tank. So you have a sensor underneath telling the machine what it needs to warm up to, but then you have one actually checking the real-time temperature. So it's telling me that I'm at 43 degrees, which is a bit warm. We just want to keep stirring that, and the unmelted chocolate's going to cool down the whole mixture. Another nice thing is that this chocolate's so fluid that if you wanted to speed things up, you could with a hand blender. So some people call it hand blender tempering, and it's just to speed up that melting of the calais and to make sure that everything is circulated really well. And it's just a really quick way of doing this. But you want to pick an appropriately powered hand blender, otherwise you can wear it out. I don't think they're designed for blending chocolate, so make sure that you've got a good amount of melted mass and that you're not blitzing calais. See, this is also another nice little feature that you can get as an add-on, and it's just a scraper that you can set up to scrape your tools down, scrape your scraper down, keep things nice and tidy without getting chocolate everywhere. So I'm going to show you the other slight cheat for getting some extra cold chocolate in when you're seeding chocolate. So right now my chocolate's sitting at around 35 degrees, so it's not quite cool enough, but if I add cold chocolate in, it's probably not going to, the chocolate's not hot enough to fully melt it, so we're just adding a little bit extra, and we're going to use a hand blender to blend it in. Again, you don't want to be blending in cold chocolate, so just stir it in to melt in as much as you can. Otherwise, you'll end up breaking your hand blender. So I don't want to be blamed for people's broken hand blenders. So they're kind of starting to melt through. I'm going to use this, just flick out the extra air. Okay, so you notice there is some bubbles, so I'm just going to stir this really well. So because these are open, they can sometimes start to cool down from the top because you can't heat the chocolate all at once. So that's why the stirring is really crucial. You can also use a heat gun or a hairdryer on warm setting to kind of help melt that top bit down and keep it nice and fluid and in temperature. This is really good tool. Couldn't go without it for holding tempered chocolate in temperature. So I'm going to just set this aside, ready to start dipping the pralines. All right, so we have a slab that I've pre-prepared. All the layers are nicely crystallized. It's not very firm, but it's going to slice really nicely on the guitar cutter. So we've got our guitar cutter. Again, this is a lab size, so it's better for smaller batches or for testing things or just small production. But essentially we've got all these different widths of cutters that we can use, and today I'm using a 22mm for just a petite bonbon. But if you can get, I think, 30mm, 40mm, there's quite a bit of flexibility there. So since we've already got our nice shablon on the bottom, we're going to slide this onto the, line it up right up to the edge. When you put it down, you just want to make sure that you're getting as minimal offcuts as possible. So I don't know if you can hear that beeping, but that's actually the digital melt and choc telling me to stir my chocolate. That's just going to help keep the temperature really nicely distributed throughout the chocolate mass. So you just press set to stop it beeping, but another nice little tool. I think melting tanks used to be quite basic in the way that they worked. They just used to hold things at a specific temperature. But these new machines are really, really cool in the way that they work and how they're programmed. All right, so back to cutting. We've got our chocolate lined up. We don't want to have any or minimal wastage, so we're going to try and line it up so that it trims it nicely. There we go. So then we pick up the piece. Just going to remove these offcuts, and then we're going to pick up the wires. Now you can see there's a bit of the crunch left on them, which we always want to clean between all cuts. So we just need to get a nice cloth, give it a wipe down before we put the tray back on. The alternative is to use one of the guitar cutters that actually comes with two, like a bi-directional guitar. So one side comes down this way and the other one comes down this way. You can pick it up and move it on to move your production along. So for this last one, you can see even with this 24 centimeter frame, which is quite small, that we're getting quite a high number of bonbons. Really good yield. So we're just going to cut again. You see it's going through like butter. And then we can remove these offcuts. And then pick up the pieces, pick up the remaining bonbons. Just going to put this aside for a minute. We've got some trays prepared. Now they're just lined with acetate. This one is what I'm going to put the finished dip bonbons onto, and this is the one that I'm going to put the bonbons ready to be dipped on. So I'm just going to push them off with line them up ready to be dipped. So you'll see that just from one small frame, we're producing lots of chocolates. And in any kind of larger production, you could be producing hundreds of bonbons per hour. And you could pair it up with an enrober to have a really, like, produce way more chocolates than you might if you were doing just molded ones. So, all right, so we've got our bonbons, excuse the arrangement. We've got our tempered chocolate. Now before we start dipping anything, we need to check the set. So we do this by taking just a plastic spatula or a I've got it here. So just a plastic spatula or a scraper, because we want something that's not conductive. If you put it on metal or marble, it can be a bit of a false test. So we just want to put it onto plastic, dip the corner in and let it set at room temperature. So that should take about 3 to 4 minutes. And we don't want to dip anything until that is perfectly tempered. So if we need to adjust the heat or stir it a bit more, we'll know pretty quickly. Just going to keep stirring, make sure it's nicely circulated so we don't get any streaks.
So Phil, a few questions from the public here. What other fruits would you recommend for a pâte de fruits?
I mean, a classic is something like raspberry. Any fruit works really. So you can take any fruit puree and cook it out to a pâte frit. They do vary in texture, so some have less pulp, which means they might need to be cooked out longer, or the recipe needs an adjustment. But every puree manufacturer actually produces a guide for pâte frits and sorbets. I love doing raspberry, it's classic, it works really well. Raspberry or cherry, but also apricot. And I wish you guys could taste this, but apricot works beautifully. It's just the aroma, the flavor, the balance of sweetness and acidity. All right.
Would you use any alcohols in the pâte de frit?
You could, yeah. So especially if you're doing a piping for a bonbon, you could blend in any kind of flavored liqueur into the, especially matching the flavor of the pâte de frit, or put it into the ganache for extra flavor.
Fantastic, that sounds great. So you'd recommend sort of using maybe an amaretto with a raspberry, or
I'd probably put it in the ganache.
In the ganache.
In the ganache, because it'll help prolong the shelf life of the ganache, if that's the flavor you're after. And also, I like adding things like zests or vanilla into a pâte de frit, just for an extra embellishment. One second. So these melting tanks can keep chocolate tempered for as long as an automatic tempering machine could keep them. So eventually chocolate will crystallize. So you can leave it for 20 or 30 minutes before you might want to kind of, actually probably up to an hour before you want to remelt the chocolate and put it through the crystallization process, because eventually it just does start to crystallize. But this will hold it in a perfect state for 1 or 2 hours. I think what happens is if you were to do this in a plastic bowl, you'd find that the edges start to set within minutes, and your window for doing a product like this is significantly shorter, and you have to keep reconditioning your chocolate. So with this, we have a couple of hours to work.
So you'd say these melting choc tanks are very useful for the chocolate.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean,
almost an essential piece of kit.
Yeah, whether it's small scale production or even, you know, we have, where I work, quite a large production, but we use tanks like this for things like white chocolate or colored chocolates, where we want to extend how long we're working for, but without having to change over 20 liters of chocolate at a time. So even in a large production, they're still really useful.
Okay, yeah, great to know. Even the small chocolatiers can make use of these, as well as large industrial.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the jump between this and an automatic tempering machine isn't worth it. I'd go from this to an automatic, not a tabletop turning one, personally. I think it's quite a big jump in price, but you get so much value out of these.
Ultimately worth it.
Yeah.
So anyway, these tanks definitely make it. You've got at least a good half an hour window of working temperature.
Definitely,
so, yeah. And we all know as chocolatiers that the longer that window of workable chocolate is, as long as it gets nice and big, that window, then
absolutely.
It's always good.
All right, let me check that test.
So, Eddie, would you recommend any specific forks for your dipping?
Yeah, so I love bent ones, and this one is my favorite. So anything with 2 or 3 prongs, but just bent, so that you're not getting, if that was flat, you'd be getting your handle or hand in chocolate really easily. So it's nice to get a bent one. And if they're not bent, I just bend them myself. You kind of want them at that 45-degree angle for the handle, and then straight for the bottom.
Similar to the palette knives that you can get.
Exactly.
Yeah, it just stops everything from messing up, and you get a nice clean cut.
All right, so that previous test that we did is much nicer. It's got a nice gloss to it. I can see one streak. That just means that I need to stir it a little bit more, and I did after that last test. So I think we're all good to go, but there's a definite gloss to it, streak free, apart from that one streak. But the way we get rid of that is just by giving it a really good stir. Can't stress how critical that stirring is. Yeah. It just means that the crystallization is circulated throughout the chocolate mass. So we're good to go. I'm going to leave that in there for a minute. Going to start by dipping some pralines. So to go with the pralines, to decorate them, I'll show you one where we just use a simple fork to create a simple design with just a line across the top, and then another one where we're going to use some alcohol that's been mixed with some metallic powder to just add a nice little ring to it. So I'm just going to move this into the center so you can see. But we have a lovely little praline. You can see we've got our gianduja, a nice ganache, and then a perfect pâte de fruits layer. So we always want to keep our fork nice and clean. If you've got any crystallizing chocolate, just wipe it off with a... So we've got our... So another thing that I've seen done is where people leave the top completely exposed, which is quite nice. So Kirsten Tibbles famously did a really lovely truffle she layered 3 layers of gianduja. So I think it was white chocolate and milk with pistachio. And when she cut it, she had these beautiful layers on the side, and then she turned them over, right, and then dipped them like this so that there was no chocolate on top, and you saw these beautiful layers. I think she won a World Cup with that bonbon, or won best chocolate for that bonbon. Yeah. But so
presenting it sort of horizontally rather than
so you have some options when
it's horizontally. Yeah, you don't have to stick with the layers horizontally. You can go vertically, and this type of chocolate really does let you play around with sort of dimensions of chocolates rather than it just being shelled. You can really experiment with layers.
So just once along the edge, slide it off the fork, push it forward, and then swipe across. Another thing you can do is just use the fork to create a nice indent as it's setting. Performance anxiety.
These things happen on live.
Yeah.
This is real life. This is what as chocolatiers go through. It's the struggles. It's not all what you see on Instagram, is it?
No.
It's hard life.
Going back to this, I'm swiping across to get a nice thin layer on top. Oop. Oop. I mean, the other thing is when you're dealing with bonbons this small, the balance on a small fork can be a bit tricky. So it's definitely one for practicing. But if you go for a slightly wider or more conservative 3 by 3 centimeter, it's much easier. So basically, if you see the width of the fork is quite small, so I might even just bend it in slightly so that I do actually have a bit more balance. And then I'll show one with the alcohol. So the metallic powders do settle in the bottom, so you do want to just agitate them slightly. That's just alcohol. The other thing is, in this bonbon, we've got a really lovely, milk chocolate in the bottom 2 layers. So using 64% like the Guayaquil is a really nice way of just tempering that sweetness.
Yeah, it's definitely something to bear in mind, isn't it? The pairing of chocolate with other chocolates.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, you don't want your bonbons to be too sweet, but at the same time, you don't want them to be too bitter.
Yeah.
I think the world of chocolate is ripe for pairings, and yeah, I think definitely the dark ones on the outside work really well as a sort of finishing touch.
Yeah.
The sort of especially the origin type ones, they are, you know, very flavoursome, very
So
nice.
we've just got that nice pattern that's the alcohol's gonna evaporate off. You can do that on quite a few at a time, just while it's still crystallizing.
So you wouldn't do it on the ones that have already crystallised?
Yeah, it's just I mean, you could, but it's just gonna look a bit rough.
Yeah.
Compared to this, where it's kind of seamless and embedded in the chocolate. So we've got our frame and a second. So we've got this nice board. We've got our acetate sheet, which we put on top. So we just stick that down to give it a nice little layer. A little bit of chocolate, just to create that shablon. You can over-crystallize some untempered chocolate or use tempered chocolate.
And what would be the main reasons of doing this?
Just
setting
kind
the
of
first layer.
You want so when you're doing a ganache, you either start with a shablon on the bottom and then pour it on. It's mainly so that you can peel back the acetate from something, and so that when you go to cut it, you have a nice clean edge. When we're doing straight ganaches, so just a single origin ganache, for example, we want to put a shablon on like this, just over-crystallized chocolate or over-crystallized tempered chocolate, so that it breaks a bit more easily on the base. But then right before we cut it, we put just a thin layer of tempered chocolate and we cut it while it's crystallizing, so we get a sharp edge. So that's our chocolate. We've got our frame on. And then over here, we have some peanut butter, which so you can see roughly 2 parts peanut butter, chunky peanut butter, with some NXT. And you just want to, the fastest way of doing this is if you've got tempered chocolate readily available, and that way you don't have to table it, you don't have to do anything, you just stir it into room temperature nut butter, and then it's ready to go. So in this particular instance, we're just mixing it to combine. Can't forget a nice little seasoning of salt. I just find nuts without salt. Yeah.
Sacrilege.
Exactly.
Definitely, yeah.
So a pinch of sea salt just to season it, temper a bit of the milk chocolate sweetness. And we're gonna, same as we did before, right up the back edge. And then this is nice and chunky, so scraping it can sometimes be a little bit fun. So I like to just spread it into the frame first and then kind of level it because it's nice and liquid.
Just to get into all the gaps first with the chunks. But this recipe would work with a smooth peanut butter?
Absolutely, yeah. It's just going to give you a smooth texture. So here I just want to give it a little bit of a clean first before I scrape, and then just give it a little kind of a shape. And then we can use the scraper just to kind of tidy it up if we need to, but that's going to level itself nicely. So I'm just going to clean up that edge, and it's going to set really nicely. And then I'm going to just put the second frame on before so I'm going to put a couple of layers. So the bottom one is 5 millimeters. Then I'm going to put a 5, a 3, and then let this set. And then for this final product, we have an aero texture. So this is just a NXT or milk chocolate with a neutral oil. But in the case of, like, if I was doing a hazelnut bar with hazelnut gianduja, I'd want to use maybe a hazelnut oil.
Yeah. So you can swap out the oils if you're wanting that flavour of oil within your
sesame, toasted peanut,
coconut.
There's some flexibility, yeah. So then we've got just a siphon. So this is the cream whipping gun with one charge, and we're going to take. Now we just need to very quickly temper this chocolate. So I'm going to do that on the table because it's just a really small amount. So it's a really small amount. It's going to go really quickly. And I'm out of spatulas.
Yeah, there's some in there, yeah.
Perfect. So for this particular recipe, I don't need to keep some chocolate in here because I'm going to just cool it down and add and mix in some oil.
And with your experience with the NXT, it's basically exactly the same as any other caliber, isn't it?
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I wouldn't say it's exactly the same. There is a very slight adjustment, but in application, it works really, really well. So, like in a gianduja or like in a bonbon like this, it works perfectly.
Yeah.
Because you have, and it just gives us that really nice kind of sweet, creamy flavor that we love of milk chocolate, but dairy-free.
Yeah. And is there any peanut butters you would necessarily avoid for this? Would there be anything
so
that
you just want to go with 100% peanut butter, so or any kind of nut butter really.
Yeah.
That doesn't have any added oils or palm oil or hydrogenated fats that are going to keep it set. Just as a personal preference, really.
Yeah.
So I've got our chocolate. We're adding 40 ml to 200 grams. These recipes will be shared separately, but we're just mixing it together. It's just going to make it really fluid, but ultimately, when we're going to whip it with this cream gun, which is going to cool it down, and then as we dispense it out into the frame, the chocolate's actually crystallizing, so we do need to temper it, and we do want it to be at a very specific temperature. So there's two ways you can do this. You can melt the NXT and the oil and cool it down to 20 degrees and then dispense it, or temper the NXT, add the oil, stir it in really well, and then put it into the gun. So just going to add this in now. You do want to work quickly because we're kind of dealing with chocolate that's setting.
So why would you put the oil in it instead of just using straight chocolate?
So it's going to give it a very specific fluidity that's going to keep it nicely aerated and also nice and soft when you go to eat it. So yeah, the alternative is if you were to use like cocoa butter or oil, you would need like a vacuum chamber to expand the air. But in this case, having it quite fluid as it's setting lets it create bigger air pockets that don't need a...
No, fantastic.
So we're just closing this.
So people shouldn't be expecting a hard crunch from this. It's sort of
it's quite soft.
It's quite soft, but still quite chocolatey indeed, and similar to the coatings that you would use on cakes and stuff like that. So
you can hear that's gone in, and when you put the gas in, it actually becomes quite cold. Okay. So we just give it about 20 or 30 shakes, and then we're going to pop it into the frame. So you want to work quickly and start at the end. So as I'm dispensing that, I can see that it's actually still quite fluid. So I want to just keep shaking it a little longer, and it's just going to stop the, it's going to start crystallizing the chocolate a little bit. So by the time you start dispensing it, you want it to be a bit airy looking, like puffy.
Bubbly.
Yeah, so I'm just going to close this before I get everywhere. You can see it's...
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Whoop.
Back.
Okay, so I'm going to admit something. I've actually only made half the recipe because I just grabbed a random pot of melted chocolate, but the correct recipe would scrape all the way to the end. Sorry about that. But we have one I prepared earlier. We're going to use the cutter again to cut it. So we've got our guitar, and I'm just going to pre-cut it with a knife just to get the specific bar size that I want to do. So it's going to be that wide. I'm going to pop the strips on here, and then I'm just going to wipe the wires down before I do my cut so I don't get all these crumbs on the top of my bar. And then we're going to cut. So then we have our metal board. And we're going to prepare these for dipping by piping some caramel and dipping them in peanuts. So it's going to be a bit like a Snickers bar. So we've got some caramel. I'm just using a pre-made filling from Nigay, but you can make your own. You just want it to be kind of soft, soft and pipeable. I'm piping that on top. And then I'm going to take the bar and dip it in some chopped roasted peanuts for an extra element. So just pressing them afterwards to fix those nuts in, so we don't want them floating around in the chocolate.
So your luster dust in alcohol. What alcohol is that you use?
So it's an 80% proof. You want something quite a really high percentage. Usually they're used in making spirits, and you want that specific grade because it's going to evaporate off the chocolate and not cause any sugar bloom if you were using something with water in it. All right, last one for now. All right. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to do just a few. So when you're dipping bars, you can use a different fork. Some of them are quite wide because you want to So these wider ones are good for bars because you want to be able to pick up the width of the bar and then put it down sideways. So In this case, because with the nuts on top, I'm going to just kind of dredge it through. And then, again, tension, using the surface tension of the chocolate to draw the excess off. And then dropping it slightly and push. And nice and a quick clean swipe. So we'll do that one more time. Dipping it in. Whoop. Get the excess off.
So I can explain what he's doing here. He's keeping the chocolate connected to the praline whilst dipping, and this pulls the chocolate off. It really helps to give the perfect thin shell there.
I think, yeah.
You were saying earlier that you don't want to sort of tap it on the side. It's definitely keep the chocolate and the stream of chocolate underneath connected to the tank, and just use that to pull the chocolate off to create a nice thin layer.
So that surface tension is really important to pull down the excess from the sides. And what happens if you're tapping it on the side is that you're actually removing all the chocolate from the bottom, and then when you go to put it down, you're going to end up with foot marks. So it's really important to just get as much off while it's in the chocolate, and then whoop. And then just a couple of taps on the edge, and then kind of lower it down, and then swipe quickly to avoid a foot. So I'm just going to put those in a cool spot to set. So just quickly, this is the new mold that I've done with Martellato. It's kind of like a pyramid cone, curved cone. But it's quite simple. It's really nice in that you can spray it from one direction and you get a really nice effect. And when the great thing about using melting chocks in general is that they are just the perfect width for filling, piping. They even come with this little device here that lets you rest your bonbons while you're filling, or for tapping out, which is quite cool. But more than anything, I think, when you're working with molded chocolates and you don't have a tempering machine, having to tap over a bowl or onto paper, you have to retemper again, and it's just messy. So I think this is, even for molding, this is quite critical.
We all know the faces we can pull whilst holding and turning out.
And like trying to not get your chocolate to spill everywhere.
Yeah.
Let me just see. Yeah, so it's a really nice kind of cone shape, really nice high shine, and yeah, I'm quite happy with it. I hope you like it too.
No, yeah, they are fantastic. If we show one up to the camera at the top, we can give some dimensions. They are fantastically, absolutely lovely shape, and they're quite deep as well, so you can definitely get a few layers in there.
I've done one with three layers.
Yeah,
works quite well.
Yes, very unique shape, and yeah, quite tall, so perfect. So yeah, I think we've answered all the questions. So I think that would be it for today. A massive thank you to Martellato and Michele and Philip.
Thank you very much.
There we go.
And thanks for having me. Thanks for putting up with the challenges of live chocolate work. But that was really fun for me, and I hope you enjoyed it and took something away from it.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Join us again for our next live.